All right, so we've covered the buyer's remedies for the seller's breach. Now we're going to look at the seller's remedies for a buyer breach. Now the remedies are going to resemble the buyer's remedies. They're very close to one another, starting with the right to performance, specific performance. And in a contract in which the buyer has breached, meaning the buyer has failed to perform, we simply want the buyer to pay. So specific performance has a different connotation when it is a seller asserting that against a buyer. It says, buyer, pay the price for the goods. The seller may also avoid the contract, again, rescission, because of a fundamental breach. The buyer has failed to pay, or the buyer has indicated that it will not pay or will not accept delivery. The seller has the right to simply avoid the contract, placing the parties in their pre-contractual position. We mentioned the seller's right to cure, and the seller also has a right to money damages, which I'll address in a separate topic. So let's talk a little bit about a seller's right to specific performance. And again, the seller can demand performance according to the contract, which is to say payment of the contract price. So if a question on your test asks about a seller's right to specific performance, they can do so, and ordinarily that performance is payment for the contract price. Now this can be impeded by the duty to mitigate. We talked about a buyer's duty to mitigate. A seller also has a duty to mitigate. And mitigation by a seller involves resale of the goods, must sell the goods to another party. So if the buyer does not accept delivery of the goods, the seller has an obligation to go out into the marketplace and attempt to resell those goods at whatever the market price is. The seller then can sue the buyer for the difference between the contract price and the market price. The market price in this case presumably less than what the contract price was. So when we demand payment, that is subject to the seller's duty to mitigate, the seller's duty to resale the goods. Now I said a seller can also avoid a contract. Seller can avoid a contract if the buyer fails to take delivery or fails to pay the purchase price or other sort of fraudulent breach. In essence, what we are looking at is if there's a fundamental breach, the seller can also walk away from the contract. The seller may choose to do so because it turns out that the contract price is better than It may turn out that the seller's market price is better than the contract price. So the seller can simply walk away from the agreement, avoid the contract, return the parties to their pre-contractual position, and then take those goods and sell them on market price, which presumably is now going to be more than the contract price. And finally, seller's right to money damages. Again, the same general measure applies. The difference between contract price and market price, meaning for a seller, what that means is that the seller expected to receive more from the contract than it's going to get from the market, and they are entitled to the difference between those two. Anticipatory breach. Anticipatory breach occurs when one party can clearly see that the other party to the contract either will not perform a substantial part of its obligation or is going to commit a fundamental breach. So, if a seller is to deliver goods by October 15th and the seller notifies the buyer it will not deliver those goods, it is going to commit a fundamental breach. It's going to fail to ship the goods. If that happens, the non-breaching party, in this case the buyer, can assert anticipatory breach. You haven't breached yet. The date of performance is not until whatever date's called for in the contract. Even though that date has not arrived, you've told me that you are not going to perform. Therefore, that creates a present fundamental breach, meaning even though the contract date of performance hasn't arrived yet, if you have notified the other party, then it's as if you are breaching right now and not at some point in the future. Now, this could also arise if the party doesn't notify the other party, but one can see that they're going to be unable to complete their obligation. So if a buyer has contracted to sell certain goods if a seller has contracted to sell goods to a buyer, and that buyer later enters a bankruptcy proceeding, declares itself insolvent, then the seller is under no obligation to perform its contract. The seller can simply declare anticipatory breach. It is a present fundamental breach, meaning the right to sue arises immediately. We don't have to wait until the time set out in the contract. So, in the event of anticipatory breach, the CISG gives the parties certain rights. First of all, they could suspend performance, meaning if I believe that you are not going to pay for the goods, I can suspend my obligation to ship the goods to you. I have a right to simply avoid performance, to cancel performance entirely. Or if it's going to be involving an installment contract, I can avoid, meaning not have to comply with future installment terms, either delivery of goods or payment on an installment basis. So in conclusion, what did we learn today? A contract places responsibilities on both the buyer and the seller. There are remedies available for the failure to perform, and the buyer and seller remedies are similar. If you have any questions about any of this, please let me know. Otherwise, I will talk to you later.